Welcome to Monsters of History. Monsters of History is a series about history's most infamous serial killers and human monsters. From ancient Greece to the Russian Empire, join me as we dig up skeletons from some of history's most reprehensible human monsters. Before we get into today's episode, I'd like to extend a quick thank you to everybody who liked and commented on my first episode. This is my first podcast ever, so I'm kind of learning things as I go here, and your comments are so helpful when it comes to figuring out how I can better improve this show for you guys. You should also expect much longer episodes such as this one in the future. I wanted to keep my first one pretty short just so I can get an opinion from people and other things that they'd like to see in future shows. In the future, I'd like to keep them around 20 to 30 minutes or longer if possible. However, unfortunately, details can be quite hard to come by when you're talking about people who are about 2,000 years old. And as such, there just might not be enough to say about them. So for cases like that, I'd like to ask you guys, what would you prefer? Would you prefer that we do maybe a longer compilation style video where we cover multiple people? Or would you prefer just releasing shorter episodes in between the longer ones, such as this one? Let me know in the comments. And finally, I'd like to thank Morgan for giving me the opportunity to be on the Leader One podcast network. I am truly blessed to be a part of such a wonderful community. And with that out of the way, let's get into the show. Today, we'll be talking about one of the most fascinating and mysterious characters of ancient Rome, Locusta of Gaul, the Imperial poisoner. However, our story begins well before the time of her birth. Between the year 50 and 58 BC, Julius Caesar famously launched one of the most ambitious and impressive conquests in Roman history. From Bordeaux, France to the Rhine River in Germany, Caesar marched his legions into Gaul territory, subjugating everything in his path. As far as Rome was concerned, Gauls were nothing but dumb, cruel barbarians. Their only place in civilized society should be to service the needs of the empire and her citizens. As such, thousands of Gallic survivors and villagers would be stripped of their freedom and marched into the heart of Rome itself to be sold off as property. Even after Roman conquests, it was not unusual for ordinary Gallic peasants to be kidnapped and forced into slavery, simply for the perceived crime of being a Gaul. Unlike the Romans, Gauls weren't nearly as meticulous at keeping records of everyday life, let alone recording such trivial things like birth certificates for the common man. As such, we don't know much about Locusta's early life. However, we do know that she was born somewhere in what we know as France today, in the 1st century AD, almost 2,000 years ago. She was born most likely just east of the Alps, near where Lyon is today. She was the only child of her parents, whose identities remain a mystery today. Growing up on a rural farm, Lacusta would become intimately familiar with herbal lore. She would spend her days shadowing her mother and learning all about the wifely duties that she was one day expected to be able to perform. Lacusta would spend her free time roaming around the countryside, becoming intimately familiar with the local wildlife and plants. In order to keep the local wildlife in check and away from their crops, Lacusta would begin to learn the deadly art of poisoning. Lacusta would get most of her pest control recipes from her mother. However, she would quickly master the art of killing and develop her own, even more lethal recipes as time went on. It was while dispatching these various pests and wild animals that she discovered her love for killing. Every morning, Lacusta and her mother would check the poisonous bait that they had left out overnight to see what kind of beast that they had thwarted that night. Due to the poison, the meat of most of the animals she killed were useless as food. However, they were still able to salvage the hides. It was while watching her father skin a wild cat where she came up with the idea of marinating the raw meat in a bowl of poison and leaving it out overnight for unsuspecting animals scouring the wilderness for food. Locusta would later recount her memories of staying up past her bedtime and staring out of her window, watching to see which animals had eaten the poisoned meat. Unfortunately, her sociopathic tendencies of gleefully cheering and laughing while animals lie on the ground and squeal in pain were never a cause for concern among her parents, as all they probably saw was a normal, happy little girl doing her best to protect the family's livestock. Other than that, much of Locusta's early life remains a mystery. We don't know much about her, other than she was taken as a slave and brought back to Rome to be sold around to the highest bidder. In ancient Rome, there were few ways to escape slavery. However, it wasn't impossible. Skilled or educated slaves were allowed to earn their own money and might hope to save enough to buy their freedom. Such slaves were often freed by the terms of their master's will, or for services rendered. A notable example of a high-status slave was Tiro, the Secretary of Cicero, a prominent Roman statesman. Tiro was freed before his master's death and was successful enough to retire on his own country estate, where he died at the age of 99. However, the master could arrange that the slaves would only have enough money to buy their freedom when they were too old to work. They could then use the money to buy a new, young slave, while the old slave, unable to work, would be forced to rely on charity to stay alive. It's believed that Locusta's master had utilized her skills in the art of poison in exchange for her own freedom. However, once again, it's not known for certain who exactly her master was, nor do we know how many victims she had, or their identities before gaining notoriety. After gaining her freedom, Locusta dedicated her life to the study of herbal lore and took her calling very seriously. She created hundreds of extracts from many plants to dispatch her clients' enemies in new and interesting ways. Her arsenal included such things as hemlock, belladonna, nightshade, arsenic, and quinine, and possibly even cyanide and opium. She was both creative and thorough, as all poisons were tested on animals to ensure their potency. Locusta had took note on what worked and what didn't, and used this to improve her poisons. It was scientific method at its finest. During her time in Rome, Locusta had learned that the people around her were ambitious and greedy. Rome was a rough-and-tumble place, even in the golden years of Pax Romana, where everyone was supposed to gather around and celebrate being in the glory of the Roman Empire. There were many people in Rome in those days who wanted to hurry along the deaths of their rivals or their rich relatives, but it had to look like the death was from natural causes or an accident. Locusta had provided them with the perfect means to accomplish their goals. She would become a professional killer. Although she was often arrested, some of her clients included the wealthiest and most influential people in Rome. Politicians, lawyers, noble families. They all played a role in ensuring that her stint in prison was short-lived. Her reputation eventually grew to such a degree that she would become somewhat of a local legend. To some, she was just a spooky boogeyman-like figure to talk about around the campfire. To others, she was their worst nightmare. Tacitus describes her in his book The Annals, quote, "This was the famous Lacusta, a woman lately condemned as a dealer in clandestine practices, but reserved among the instruments of state to serve the purposes of dark ambition. By this tool of iniquity the mixture was prepared," unquote. In 54 AD, she had made such a name for herself that she had caught the eye of Empress Julia Agrippina, the fourth wife of Emperor Claudius. Although Claudius had a son and heir from his previous disastrous marriage to Messalina, he ran out and married his niece, who had her own grown son. This was not about to end well. Agrippina did have ambitions for her son, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Even if you don't know much about Roman history, you've probably heard of Nero, who was accused of fiddling while Rome burned. No one really thinks that he did, but it is a testament to his character that the rumors seemed plausible at the time. Agrippina wanted to see her son as Emperor of Rome, and there were two people standing in his way, Claudius and his son Britannicus. Claudius was not a foolish man, and proved to be one of Locusta's most challenging victims. When he became emperor, he knew that it would be a dangerous business. He had taken every precaution he could in terms of his personal safety. Along with several loyal bodyguards, Claudius also hired dedicated food tasters, whose full-time job it was to taste every single thing that he would eat, to ensure that it wasn't tampered with. Claudius also had the odd habit of tickling his throat with a feather after a meal and throwing up, so that he may indulge himself once again. This quirk would also limit the time that any poison could act. However, in the end, Claudius was still no match for Locusta's wit and ingenuity. It was on October 13th, 54 AD, when Lacusta had infiltrated the emperor's quarters. Lacusta had whipped up a snack for one of his bodyguards laced with a sort of laxative. While the bodyguard ran to the nearest latrine with explosive diarrhea, Agrippina had bribed the food tasters to stay home that day. Lacusta had also prepared Claudius's favorite meal, a simple plate of mushrooms. However, these were seasoned with Asinite, also known as the Devil's Helmet, or the Queen of Poisons. Asinite is a flower which has extremely toxic roots. If consumed even in small amounts, it's guaranteed to kill somebody approximately 2 to 6 hours if left untreated. The initial signs of Asinite poisoning are gastrointestinal, including nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. This is followed by a sensation of burning, tingling, and numbness in the mouth and face, and burning in the abdomen. However, in larger amounts, death can come within minutes. In severe poisonings, pronounced motor weakness occurs and sensations of tingling and numbness spread to the limbs. Cardiovascular features include hypotension, sinus bradycardia, and ventricular arrhythmias. Other symptoms may include sweating, dizziness, difficulty in breathing, migraines, and confusion. Even though it may be quick, your last few minutes living will be spent in complete agony. When it's all said and done, the only post-mortem signs are those of asphyxia. Claudius promptly devoured these mushrooms without thinking twice. Due to the large amounts of asinite, Claudius quickly fell to the ground and began screaming in pain. Agrippina, feigning concern, quickly knelt beside the emperor, asking, "Was it something you ate, dear?" She then provided him with his trusted puking feather. Unbeknownst to Claudius, Lacusta had also gotten her hands on the feather and laced it with strychnine. Strychnine comes from the seeds of a strychnos tree. The poison itself often takes the form of a colorless, odorless, bitter powder. Its symptoms, according to the CDC, include agitation, restlessness, painful muscle spasms, uncontrollable arching of the neck and back, jaw tightness, and difficulty breathing. Agrippina ran the feather down his throat in a vain attempt to expel the poison. However, just as quick as it had happened, the great Emperor Claudius took his last breath. This ushered in a new era for the people of Rome. The 16-year-old boy Nero was now the new emperor of one of the world's biggest and most powerful empires in history. Agrippina was thrilled with the death of Claudius and her son as the new emperor. In order to evade suspicion, Agrippina had betrayed Locusta and accused her of solely murdering Claudius. Lacusta was promptly arrested and quickly given the death sentence. While awaiting execution, she was visited by the most unlikely of patrons. It was Rome's newest emperor in the flesh. Nero was beginning to chafe at his mother's overbearing ways, as she was turning her attention to the younger Britannicus in hopes that he might be more moldable. By now, Britannicus was almost 14 years old, which would make him a man in Roman society. He could challenge Nero. He had to go. Lacusta was sprung from prison in 55 AD and given a general pardon from any crimes she had previously committed, as well as a generous amount of money and land. This would mark the beginning of Lacusta's career as Emperor Nero's personal assassin. Unfortunately, we're once again spared the details of Lacusta's career as an Imperial assassin, and the names of her victims. Orders to assassinate Nero's rivals were seldom written down, instead opting to personally relay the information to her himself. That, coupled with the fact that almost every murder Locusta had carried out was made to look like an accident, disease, or natural causes. However, we do see Locusta show up once again when Nero calls on her to assist him in murdering his brother, Tiberius Claudius Caesar Britannicus. February 11th, 55 AD, was a normal evening at the dinner table for Nero and his family. The wine was brought in and poured into goblets. The food tasters each tried the goblets of wine and handed the goblets to the family members. Nero, his mother Agrippina, several other close relatives, and young Britannicus, all completely unaware of the plot. As Britannicus took a sip of the wine, he handed it back to the taster, complaining that the wine was too hot. It was a curious Roman custom of the 1st century to dilute their dinner wines with hot water. The food taster added some cold water into the wine and handed it back to the boy. However, the taster had failed to taste the cold, clear water that he had added to Britannicus's goblet, and that was where Lacusta had slipped her poisonous concoction. As Britannicus fell into convulsions, Nero calmly reminded the dinner party that Britannicus simply suffered from epilepsy and refused to summon any assistance for the convulsing boy. Agrippina's eyes grew wide. She knew exactly what her son was doing. She recognized the plot, and all of this without consulting her. She resumed eating dinner calmly, careful not to let her face show any sign of the terror that was filling her heart, that she could become the next target. The other family members soon conformed to the calm and cautious return to the evening meal, while the boy foundered and convulsed on the floor. No one was brave enough or foolish enough to do anything about Britannicus against Nero's wishes. Presently, Nero called for the servants to remove Britannicus from the room. The emperor's would-be rival died a few hours later and was hastily buried that same night. Despite a great storm and the furtive gossip of the people of Rome, with Emperor Nero as one of her satisfied customers, Locusta enjoyed a growing reputation and expanding wealth beyond her wildest dreams. The emperor had lavished her with land, money, gifts, and a full pardon for all of the poisonings she had been charged with over the years. There were many Imperial referrals and more assignments. Lacusta was very busy with her contract work and poisonings for hire, and even opened a school where she taught others her knowledge of herbs and toxins. With the patronage of the emperor, Locusta enjoyed a period of great business success, until the Roman Senate finally gathered the nerve to condemn Nero to death in 68 AD. Locusta had thoughtfully furnished Nero with the poison kit for himself, but in the confusion of the moment, Nero left the kit behind before he could be brought before the Roman Senate to stand trial for his many crimes. Nero killed himself with his own dagger. After Nero's death, Locusta's safety net had disappeared. She was promptly arrested by his successor, Emperor Galba, and dragged through the streets in chains and executed her. Legend said she was killed in a very distasteful way, raped by a wild animal in the arena, most likely a giraffe. Now, the Romans were brutal, but thankfully, this is most likely fiction. Only one book, The Encyclopedia of Serial Killers by Michael Newton, in only the first edition, cites Apuleius as one of the sources. In the book, The Golden Ass, Apuleius does tell a story like this, but he does not say that the woman was Lacusta, and on top of that, the story itself was fictional anyway. The only clue to her death we have comes from Cassius Dio, quote, "In the case, however, of Helios, Narcissus, Petrobius, Locusta, the sorceress, and others of the scum that had come to the surface in Nero's day, Emperor Galba ordered them to be led in chains throughout the whole city, and then to be executed." And thus ends the story of Nero's imperial poisoner. The Witch of Rome would now meet her untimely demise.